And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and my guest in the studio, Andrew Tatarsky, who has written this book about harm reduction in psychotherapy. He's a harm reduction psychotherapist, and we're going to be talking about what harm reduction is and what harm reduction psychotherapists do in just a moment. I just wanted to point out that Miss Moosey, Joan Moosey, is not with us. She will be here next week and gives us her love, and may even join us by phone later on in the show. So anyway, Andrew Tatarsky, welcome to Let Them Talk.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, great, great.
Yeah.
So two things, a harm reduction and psychotherapy. Here's your book. Very interesting, very, it's a book that looks like it has a lot of information about this subject. What is harm reduction? Of course, it has to do with drugs, with people who use illegal drugs for the most part, not necessarily. And tell us a little bit what that is.
Okay, harm reduction is an alternative approach to working with substance use problems and other risky behaviors. It's really an antidote or the antithesis of the traditional abstinence-only approach that is really the prevailing approach in this country.
Sure.
And by any stretch of the imagination, the abstinence-only approach essentially fails abysmally to help the overwhelming majority of people with substance use problems. Harm reduction offers a whole other framework for engaging people, helping them get started in their own process of change, and supporting people in reaching their goals.
So it has a different... Let's look at the history of because before 1914 in the United States, drugs were not even illegal.
That's right.
There's plenty of stories we've heard. Many of us have heard those stories. If you haven't, there's many stories about drugs that we consider illegal today, like cocaine, morphine, heroin, being over-the-counter, available as over-the-counter medicines, and actually even being advertised and being in products like Coca-Cola. Yet that changed drastically, and you had really a sea change in American attitudes towards drugs. Now, do you feel that change had to come, or that it was what was behind that change?
Well, historically, before 1914, when all of these patent medicines, many of them containing heroin and cocaine and other drugs,
like
were available.
Coca-Cola, for example.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Vini Martini, which was a cocaine-laced wine that the Pope drank, among other people.
I'm sure he loved it.
You know, there was clearly a proliferation of these substances, and a tremendous amount of people developed problems with them. And in 1914, the Harrison Act illegalized these substances. And effectively, what happened at that point is we turned a health problem into a criminal problem. We criminalized drugs and drug use, and that sort of set the stage for the modern era.
Now, to me, the ultimate was prohibition, when alcohol was actually made illegal in 1919, I guess, and then for 10 years after that, you couldn't buy a beer. And then we all are familiar, most of us are familiar with the movies, with the Untouchables television programs. We know Al Capone, that organized crime exploded, and that the first really war on drugs, that drug being alcohol, occurred in American history.
That's right.
And what did people, I mean, were there any less alcoholics after Prohibition than before? Did they do something? Did Prohibition, at least for all that expense, reduce drug use in America, or alcohol use?
We don't believe that Prohibition reduced alcoholism. Just like with the current Prohibition against other drugs, you drove it underground, and you brought drug users into contact with a criminal element, with unregulated drugs, and in fact, arguments can be made that the harms associated with drinking and drug use, proliferated tremendously.
Let's take a leap now further to the late 1930s in marijuana. Now, marijuana was that regulated before the 1930s?
I don't believe so. I believe Harry Anslinger was a federal agent or DEA agent who sort of spearheaded a national movement from state to state to illegalize marijuana. There was a fascinating film that came out some years ago that essentially gave the history of
Grass,
the illegalization of grass.
Yeah, excellent movie. I've seen that movie.
And
yeah.
what you saw is that over the course of the war against marijuana, you see an increase in money being spent to fight against marijuana, and you see an increase in use, as evidenced by seizures of marijuana. So clearly, the war against marijuana was an absolute failure.
The reason I'm going
that may be the most obvious example of that we have documented.
That when it was made illegal, its use skyrocketed.
That's right.
Interesting. The reason I'm going through this history for folks is that I think a lot of people think, well, drugs have always been thought of as bad and they've always been illegal, but no, there's a relatively recent history of this in American culture. Let's jump 1960s, 1970s. Richard Nixon decides that hippies are smoking too much marijuana and begins what becomes under Reagan the war on drugs. Now we're sort of at the other side of that. We have now medical marijuana in certain states. There's obviously been a reaction to that, interestingly enough.
Well, let's back up a moment, because I think it's important for us to consider that the consequences of the war on drugs is that we now have more Americans incarcerated for drug-related crimes, not violent crimes, but drug-related crimes, than every European citizen in the European Union.
Sure.
Just the folks that are incarcerated for drug-related crimes here.
So that's been the result of a century of, since 1914 to almost 2014, a century of prohibition. We have more people in prison than ever before.
Times are changing, though, and I think it's important to note that the current drug czar, Kurlikowski, has, in the past year, stated that the war on drugs is actually a war against people. And he stated the intention to begin reversing that movement, to put more attention to treatment and to care of people who are struggling rather than incarceration.
Sure.
So we are in the midst of, I think, of a sea change in a number of ways, one of which is evidenced by what you're talking about, which
medical
is
marijuana
that's
and
right.
things like that. Now, I want to, here's Harm Reduction Psychotherapy. This is your book. Tell us a little bit about your book, Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, Andrew.
Okay, just to back up a moment,
Sure.
While we've been living through the criminalization and the prohibition of drugs, we have a drug treatment system that has grown up and proliferated
That's what I wanted to
that
get
essentially institutionalizes prohibition in its abstinence-only focus. That is, the only acceptable goal of traditional treatment is abstinence. And very frequently, the only way that people can get into treatment or stay in treatment is if they embrace abstinence. Which means that the overwhelming majority of people who are not ready, willing, or able to embrace abstinence, which I would argue is the overwhelming majority of drug users, are effectively denied treatment. So you have a treatment system, a multi-billion-dollar treatment system, which fails most drug and alcohol users, and then you have a criminal justice system waiting to arrest them when they get out of control.
Now, Andrew, how'd you get into psychotherapy, of harm reduction psychotherapy, when I doubt if was there any coursework in any college or any university or any graduate program that would even, even if they believed in harm reduction, they'd be afraid to say it.
Well, this book is in part the story of my transformation, my evolution as a drug treatment expert. When I first got into the field back in the early 80s, I came in working in traditional drug treatment. I was a counselor, I was a program director, a psychologist, which I am today, and I learned the traditional approach. Over the course of the first 7 years or so of my career, and at one point working as a clinical director for an intensive outpatient program, I came to see that the majority of the people that were coming to our program were not sticking and were not stopping. And so by the standard of abstinence, we were failing the majority of the patients. That experience, which was increasingly disturbing and confusing to me because the model said that's the only thing that could work, caused me to begin to rethink the assumptions, and that basic abstinence assumption seemed to be the limiting factor. I began to look around for alternatives and experimenting with treating active drug users in my practice. Lo and behold, many of them effectively engaged in treatment. Many of them reduced or stopped their use and dealt with other issues. I began to search around for a model that would explain that And a very close colleague and mentor, recently died, Alan Marlatt, said to me, "Andrew, you're doing harm reduction work." That moment, which was sort of this seminal moment that changed the trajectory of my career, introduced me to a new model that explained the failure of the traditional approach and sort of offered a framework that I think, and this is where I've come to believe with harm reduction psychotherapy, offers an essential set of principles that offer an alternative that can more effectively engage people, partner with them on their path toward positive change, and promote optimal outcomes. So since that moment, I've devoted my career to drawing out the implications of the harm reduction model for psychotherapy and counseling. And that's what you see in this book and other recent publications.
And people can learn more about you. You have a website, right, Andrew?
Yeah.
So why don't you tell folks what your website is?
My website is andrewtatarsky.com.
Spell it out for folks.
Okay, ANDREWTATARSKY.com. On the website, I've got a publications page, which has a number of more recent papers that I've written, sort of spelling out this approach. People can go to and download for free. There's also a blog that you can click on, and that has loads and loads of articles and data and research that supports this approach.
So let's talk a little bit because, I saw an interesting movie. I won't say the name of it, but it was about a famous a B-movie star by the name of Bela Lugosi. You might be familiar with him. He was the first... Dracula, right? The guy who did Dracula, right, with the accent. Now, he was the first... I didn't know this until I saw this movie. He was the first movie star to publicly go into rehab in the 1950s. What would he have faced? What was rehab like in the 1950s? What did that mean?
I'm not so sure about rehab in the 50s, but I wouldn't be surprised if rehabs today are frequently not very different
from that.
Most
somebody goes in, their lives are sort of falling down around them, and they're using too much heroin, and their friends are trying to get them to do something.
Okay, well, one of the, I think, overarching ideas for people to consider is that we are in the midst of a scientific revolution in how we understand substance use problems and their treatment. There's an old paradigm, an old kind of crude disease concept of addiction that was coined in 1943 by Emil Jelinek, based on a survey of AA members. And based on this small survey, he wrote a paper called The Disease Concept of Addiction, in which he described what he called a permanent, chronic, progressive illness that is only arrested by complete and total abstinence. So it's a kind of a very coherent story that describes substance use problems, and it suggests a certain treatment paradigm, which is only abstinence is an acceptable goal. Now, that model essentially has been bought and is being sold by the overwhelming majority of addiction treatment programs in this country. The fact is that more recent research, theory, outcome studies support an entirely different model, and it's a model that we call a psychobiosocial model. It integrates the fact that there are many different factors that may contribute to problematic substance use, that those factors are really unique for each person, and that the most effective treatment approach is going to be one that's going to be uniquely tailored to the strengths, the needs, the context, the family background of each individual user, and that's figured out collaboratively with the therapist. And so that out of that collaborative exploration, assessment, personal goals and personal strategies are adapted for each individual. So as opposed to the standard kind of one-size-fits-all abstinence-based approach, this is an approach that will tailor interventions to each individual, and out of that you may find some people choosing and successfully achieving safer use, reduced use, and some people embracing abstinence. So this harm reduction umbrella actually includes abstinence as one possible outcome. But what it assumes is that people are unique, that there and vary in every way that humans do, and that treatments need to embrace that diversity and that complexity if they're going to be effective in helping people change.
Sure. Now, I've heard this argument presented to people who support the traditional method, and they just look me right in the eye and say, it's against the law.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not about drug use. It's about when the government says it's against the law, you're supposed to not break the law. And that abstinence is really you getting in line with the program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're changing the law. Obviously, that leaves you no alternative but to change the law. But also, it puts you on the edge somehow. You know, you have all the qualifications and the certifications, but you're working a little on the edge. And what kind? Do you get support from your peers in this kind of work?
Well, when I began working in harm reduction back in the early 90s, harm reduction in most quarters in the United States was a dirty word. It was blasphemy. People thought, you know, you're enabling people to use. You are colluding with the disease. Right. You know, you're supporting the denial.
If we only make cancer illegal, it would be the end of it, right? Doctors wouldn't collude anymore.
Well, that's right. And one of my favorite and most well-respected physician friends, Dr. Robert Newman, who has been the director of almost every hospital, says, you know, we don't throw diabetics out of treatment if they eat a Twinkie.
That's true.
You know, we don't dictate to any other folks that are struggling with various issues terms that you need to sort of, you know, submit to our terms or we deny you treatment. A good medical practice is always about you meet people where they are, you know, you collaborate to establish a relationship that's going to empower people to make better choices and to move at the pace that they are able to move at. That's the essence of harm reduction work. The basic principles are we need to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. We need to meet them with compassion, because the only way we're going to have a chance of having a meaningful relationship that's going to support them in getting started is if we have compassion and understanding. Then we embrace any positive change, as opposed to abstinence only. Any positive change. And what that does is it redefines the process of how people change in small steps, small positive steps which build. And we don't need to know the outcome of the journey in order for people to get started. So why not put our emphasis on how we can partner with people to help them get started in their process.
Now, Andrew Tatarsky, author of Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, a new treatment for drug and alcohol problems, which is published by Aronson. I have to read this here. Aronson Press, and which is, I imagine, available on the usual places. Just type it in. I'm going to show people the book. And tell us a little bit about specifically. Let's say someone comes in. How do you judge or address their need? Let's say a person. I showed a movie about a person. You might have seen it. It was a film in which a person literally had a $5,000 a week heroin addiction. He was a stockbroker and still stealing from cars. His girlfriend had died. His mother was almost died. I mean, everybody around him was doing. And he said one day, I got to do something about this. It's the most miserable life imaginable.
So there's the opening. Here's a man who's using lots of cocaine. He's threatening his life, his wife, his job, and yet there's something in his experience that has him concerned about his use, which is the motivator. Now, we could approach that guy in two ways. We could say, okay, guy, what you got to do is stop everything, go into a 30-day rehab, throw out all your numbers, stop seeing your friends, et cetera, et cetera. If he did it, that might be a wonderful thing. So I want to say that I think that when people need and want and are open to a residential treatment program, that can be a life-saving thing, and it can be a great thing.
He's been in and out of treatment centers, and he was at wit's end.
Well, but if this man said, "I'm not going to go to rehab," like a popular song we heard recently, But he said, you know what, I am willing to sit down and to start to look at my drug use and start to look at the reasons that I'm using and to begin to put my head together with you to figure out, what do I need to do? You know, what goals make the most sense for me? What strategy am I willing to embrace that's going to be helpful to me? Yeah. Now we've got a process started. The key for me is that I want to find whatever it is that's important to a given individual that motivates them and brings them in to get started. What the harm reduction approach says is that wherever you're ready to get started, we want to meet you. And we want to partner with you and support you in beginning this process. In many cases, I might meet with somebody and we agree, you know, this is a life-threatening situation, and the most important step is for you to get into a safe place. And I make those, that can be a great harm reduction intervention.
Right.
But if people say, I'm not there, you know, but I am ready or willing to start to do some other things, you know, we're open to a whole range of possibilities.
Is cocaine the biggest one? Heroin? Which are the biggest ones? How about alcohol,
today?
Cigarettes, and things like that?
Well, I want to say something just based upon that I think is important for us all to begin to embrace. We are all substance users. Humans...
I have my coffee every morning.
Humans use substances, and one of the things I love to ask groups of health professionals is, you know, don't raise your hands, but how many of you smoke cigarettes, drink coffee, drink Diet Coke, eat sugary things, load your food up with salt, smoke a joint occasionally, or have a glass of wine.
Vicodin, like the famous movie television doctor we see every day, every week.
Vicodin,
or one after another until he's going nuts.
Or take prescribed sleeping pills or sedatives. Or what flows from that is the notion that all of these substances have possible or potential benefits. All of them have risks.
Yeah.
So if we bring all substance use into the same kind of conversation about health, about wellness, about personal choice, about optimal living, and we empower people to begin making better choices with information, with skills, with support, people begin to make positive changes.
Wow, very interesting.
There's some stories in the book that people might be interested in hearing about.
Oh, great. And, well, you know, I want to ask you, because we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you about the most famous drug abuser, whatever term you want to use in the media today, and that's
Charlie Sheen.
Charlie Sheen. Now, you know, the America's unemployed winner, a representative, advocate of all of America's unemployed winners. Now, what did you think watching that whole, I don't know if I'd call it a meltdown or a standing up for his rights? What was it?
Well, I don't know if you know, if this is a set-up question, but I wrote a piece that's on my blog called In Defense of Charlie Sheen.
Sure.
I don't know Charlie Sheen. I haven't evaluated Charlie Sheen. I think it's irresponsible for people to be making statements about whether he's an addict out of control or a manic depressive. We can't judge or evaluate people. Or a funny guy. Maybe he's goofing with all of us.
Yes.
We don't know.
I got to lose a little bit of that.
But the remarkable thing is that whatever you think of Charlie Sheen, and I know a lot of people have a lot of trouble with him as a human in terms of his life choices and attitudes about women and so on. All of the statements that he's made about addiction and recovery are consistent with current research and thinking in the addictive behaviors field.
Right.
It is absolutely amazing. When he says, I cured myself with my mind, every person with an addictive issue cures themselves with their minds.
Very good.
When he says he's not going to buy into this old model that's vintage balderdash, is he talking about that paradigm shift that I was speaking about before, the disease concept? And when he says, I'm not an addict, is he rejecting a label that other people are constructing for him? And I think that we need to be real careful about our languaging, because when we create a label which creates a permanent identity for somebody, that may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. A different way to talk about it is that this man may be using substances excessively because of all sorts of pressures and personal issues and things that he's struggling with.
Job.
That's right. And that it's not about addiction, but it's about him struggling in ways that can be very self-destructive. And maybe the man needs a place where he can sit down and get some help in sorting through who he is, what he's struggling with in his life, and why he expresses it in that way around drug use.
So actually what he was expressing are many hooks that could be used to get him into a harm reduction program.
Well, thank you, because another point about that is there are so many people out there in America who have heard this message: if you don't do it this way, if you don't do it my way, you're just going to die. You're in denial. This disempowering message hurts people, because what we know in the field is that there are as many routes to change as there are humans. And so what we should be supporting is the idea that we want to help each person find their particular route and what works for them. So if 22 years of rehab hasn't worked for Charlie Sheen, maybe he's right and needs to be supported in his idea that he needs to find another way. And how many Americans have experienced that? We see celebrity after celebrity, like Lindsay Lohan and others, in and out and in and out, and what they're told is that you're the reason it's not working, rather than another possibility, which is that the treatment may be wrong.
So the simplest answer, right, it seems, and yet it's the farthest one, because, again, it comes around to the whole thing of the example. A lot of people were very angry. I saw there was the one pop drug treatment person who's out on TV, right, who has made a point of saying about Charlie Sheen that he almost said he hoped he died because he was setting a bad example by continuing to live and saying the things he's saying.
Well, this is a corollary of the disease concept that says that, you know, you've got to do it this way. There's a one-size-fits-all approach, and if you don't get with this program, you're going to die. And that the way that people get convinced to accept the program is by suffering more. Now, that's a dangerous statement, because when people suffer more and they're denied treatment, many of them feel worse, get worse, and they die. So is it the disease that sets up the death and the relapse, or is it the treatment model that basically denies people treatment? I want to say the exact opposite, which is that people who are struggling with substances are suffering, either from the reasons that they're using, or because of their substance use, or because they don't have the skills, the knowledge.
Thank you, Andrew Tatarsky, for joining us on Let Them Talk. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you.